I got some folks in Alabama that are always saying that Governor Wallace has ambitions. He's personally ambitious. Well, what's so wrong with being ambitious to represent people that need representing in the country? What's wrong about it? They don't say Mr. Nixon is personally ambitious, and they don't say Mr. Humphrey is personally ambitious, and Mr. Harris, and Mr. McGovern, and Mr. Kennedy, and the rest of them, but it's always that inferiority complex that prevails in some of these too highly educated editors who look down their nose at every man who's sitting here tonight and every man in our own state and says, we're not quite up to being involved in national politics. Well, you know, when I lost that attitude of any complex I might have had after reading the press releases and Madison Avenue coverage of the Rockefellers and the Kennedys and the Humphreys, and no personal disrespect meant, but as governor, I met all of those people. And I sat and talked with them, and I saw that they are no super geniuses. They don't have the answer for all the problems that exist. And I've even asked governors of states as large as New York, what are you going to do about a certain problem? And they answered like a lot of us sometimes have to answer, I just don't know. They didn't know themselves. And I found out that when I went to a governor's conference in 1963, right on through 1966, and then Governor Lurleen ran for governor, I used to tell them in Alabama, and I tell them as far as this political scene is concerned, that when I went to a governor's conference, I didn't take a back seat and sit 2 or 3 feet behind the governor of Michigan, Ohio, California, or Florida, any other state. I sat right up even with the rest of them because I represented just as good and fine people as existed, and we knew just as much about problems and solutions and maybe better solutions than some of them. So the point I'm trying to make, even to some of your own liberal papers in this state, they poo-poo the idea of some movement originated in our region of the country, but I can tell you from the crowds we had in Madison Square Garden, in Cobo Hall in Detroit, and the War Memorial Auditorium in Buffalo that we do represent the majority viewpoint. And the fact that we still represent a tremendous viewpoint is that I am still, as your spokesman, not as George Wallace, invited to participate on programs such as Meet the Press and Face the Nation and Issues and Answers. I'm going to speak to the National Press Club again, the 3rd time. I used to tell that. I've been invited the 27th of September. I'm going to be in New York City, I think the 25th, at a dinner at the Americana Hotel given by our supporters there. But they have invited us to the National Press Club. You folks know that that's the very prestigious Washington Press Club made up of the high hoi polloi of the press from all over the world and the United States. That's where Castro spoke. That's where... That's where Khrushchev spoke. And I spoke right after them, and did you know I drew just as big a crowd as Castro and Khrushchev. I don't know if you recall it or not, and if I tell it again, but it bears telling, because I'm going back there. But the first time I spoke there a few years ago as governor the first time, the executive committee met after I spoke, and voted not to give me the little traditional certificate that says we thank you for having visited us and appeared on our program. You know, like the Lions Club gives you, you know, when you speak at the Rotary Club, a little certificate that says the Lions Club of so-and-so, city of Panama City says, or Jacksonville, we appreciate you being with us. Something for your scrapbook. I'm the only man in the history of speaking to that club that didn't receive the certificate that time. And they said they didn't like Governor Wallace's tactics. So I came back and asked him, well, you gave Castro one, and you gave Khrushchev one, you must like that tactic. So I'm sort of glad they didn't give it to me, because it gave me something to talk about, because I used to say, and I don't want you to think I'm trying to be risque, but I used to say, well, as far as that little certificate is concerned, the National Press Club, they can take it, and they know what they can do with it. And you know, when I spoke there the second time, they gave me the certificate, but I am the only candidate, the only speaker that ever spoke to them in which they framed it and gave it to me. And I think you know why. So I'm going back. I'm going back to the National Press Club. Well, I was on Meet the Press not long. You know, when I went off in 63 and 4, when I got in those primaries in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Maryland, I was on many programs, you know, local programs where you typical, you know, three commentators, interrogators asking you questions. I was up, you know, anywhere you go, Cincinnati, Detroit, you on all, they ask you to be on them, you know, a little minute to a mini Meet the Press and Face the Nation, issues and answers, because they were local stations. And you know, in those days, when I used to be on Meet the Press, you know how they used to jump down your throat, you know, we were deep Southern folks, and now they're a little more respectful, at least, I can say that, when you appear on the programs, because as one of them asked me one time, he says, well, what about the Non-Proliferation Treaty? He didn't think I knew what it was. So I told him the other day at the National Press Club at breakfast when I ate with 20 of the top writers in the country, I said, Joe, what about this proliferation business? Let's keep talking about it. Well, they didn't think we knew about it, but I knew what it was about, and I told them I was going to keep on proliferating in this country, too, till we got some satisfaction, at least in our voice, was recognized. But anyway, what I was trying to say is that when I went on those programs many years ago, 63, 4, immediately they jumped down your throat. Here's a redneck governor from down where they don't know how to get across the street, and everybody's barefooted and doesn't know how many states are in the Union, and very discourteous and disrespectful. And I was way off in Portland, Oregon, way away from Alabama, not worrying about my dignity to my home folks, you know, trying to be calm and cool. So we had it hot and heavy because these three commentators, interrogators, were telling me how we ought to solve the problems in Alabama. And I asked him, have you ever been to Alabama? No, he hadn't ever been. Neither one of them had been. I said, well, I've been to Oregon 3 times. I've been to Eugene once, and I've been to Portland 3 times. And even those visits does not qualify me to tell you how to solve any problem locally that exists here in Oregon, and therefore I don't attempt to do so. And finally, we had it backwards and forwards, hot and heavy. And finally, one of them said, Governor Wallace, you sound like you are the smartest man in the country. And I said, no, sir, I am not the smartest man in Oregon, and I'm not the smartest man in Alabama, and I'm not the smartest man in the country, but I sure am the smartest man on this television program. Well, in 1968, one of the great effectiveness of your program and of your interest and efforts was that before the campaign was over, Mr. Nixon sounded as if his speeches were being written in Duval County, Florida. Sounded as if they were written in my little home county of Barber, because he was saying in the main exactly what most of us say. And even Mr. Humphrey was saying the same thing. And the other day when I saw Senator Humphrey, when he was in Alabama, he admitted over television that the votes that I received mostly were taken from him. So we were very effective in 1968. Now, don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise, because you were. We know that the issues of law and order, which is still an issue in this country, was taken up by Mr. Nixon. Matter of tax reform was taken up by the Democratic Party. And those were 2 issues of which we talked very long and strong. And I can recall that neither National Democratic or Republican Party candidate wanted to talk about these matters because they thought it was equation with racism. But when I spoke about them in the overflow crowds we had from San Diego to Buffalo, and which the average citizen by the thousands came to hear us, for instance, in Flint, Michigan, outdrawing the Republicans or the Democrats 2 to 3 times as many as they had when they spoke there. And when they saw the average citizen, working man, businessman, farmer stand and applaud the matter of law and order and the matter of safety in the streets, well then our movement acted sort of as the bell cow for them, and they eventually began to say identically the same thing, and therein it was good. We oriented them toward the middle, and although our purpose was really to win, or to see that either one of those won, and which we almost did that, although that wasn't our prime purpose, I want the news media to know, we did present issues in such fashion that the other parties picked them up. Sometimes I like to say that Mr. Nixon was elected president on our platform, and now he's running the country on Mr. Humphrey's platform. Law and order is still an issue in this country, and it will be for a long time to come. And I think that's another reason why we ought to take an opportunity to say, as I said then many times, and you heard me, thank goodness for the police and firemen in this country. If it were not for them, you couldn't walk in the streets, much less ride in them. And so I do know that issue today is one that continues. And when they say the crime rate has gone down in Washington, you ask the Washington police. They've got a different method of bookkeeping. They used to, when you rob somebody, they charge you with robbery, assault with a weapon, assault and battery, disorderly conduct, 6 or 7 charges. And now when you get robbed or mugged on the street, they just charge you with robbery, see? And so that's 5 less crimes committed in that one instance. And the police will tell you that not only has crime not receded in the nation's capital, but it has increased. It's just a matter of bookkeeping. That's all it is, a matter of bookkeeping, and every policeman in Washington knows it. And I'll tell you another issue that we need to talk about in the future, and for the press who are watching for this, no one is making any announcement about running, but we are still interested. We're going to keep our organization going, and I think it's good to let them wonder and worry, because we are already influencing the attitude of prospective candidates for the Democratic Party, and even attitudes by some of those who want to be the vice president candidate for the Republicans. But we are interested, and all of us are still here, and this is the first new party movement in the history of our country that held the same amount of strength without any significant effort at what we received in 1968, and that's what the Gallup poll shows, that we are the same as we were in 1968, without any significant effort. And you know, if there's a fourth party, which there's a great likelihood there will be, then our movement becomes even more significant. And they are, of course, concerned about it, and that's great. They're not concerned about George Wallace. I see the cartoons, but they're worried about you. I represent you because I was given the prestigious position of governor of a state. Doesn't have any power and authority anymore. The governor doesn't. One federal judge can strike down what all the governors do with one stroke, and if you walked in the auditorium here, you wouldn't recognize him if you saw him, but it still has prestige. And so another great issue we raised was the matter of taxes. And you know, they introduced a bill after the election in which they asked that some taxes be imposed upon the foundations, because the average man, businessman, and working man in this country is taxed to death, and the great middle class is being slowly strangled to death by, on the one hand, folks who won't work, and on the other hand, by people in the foundations who've sheltered their multi-billions and multi-million dollars. And every one of you, I'm sure, aware of the fact that when the income tax was passed, it was passed, they say, for the purpose of trying to soak some of those who might have had more money than they ought to have. And I'm not against people having money, not at all. But at the same time they passed that, at the same time they passed the income tax, they also passed the foundation shelter law to shelter the ultra-rich like the Rockefellers and the Fords and the Mellons and the Carnegies and the Sloans and the Ketlands and all of that group, who have used so much of their money to undermine and to promote subversive activities in this country, because it looks like that the ultra-rich who sheltered their money in those foundations, they don't care who runs the country, whether it's socialists or communists or Democrats or Republicans, as long as they control and have their money. And I went to Washington some time ago, and for the first time, I think in a decade or so at least, I've asked leave to file a suit before the Supreme Court of the United States to declare unconstitutional the tax-exempt status of the multi-billion and multi-million dollar foundations, and also to ask that commercial property used in commerce have that exemption removed also, because there's $103 billion owned in competition with private business and private enterprise, and there are upwards of billions and billions untold that escape taxes because they are sheltered under the so-called foundation law. And I hope the Supreme Court allows me success in filing this suit, because if they paid taxes like you pay them, your taxes could be half of what they are today. And so I want to see if the Supreme Court is as interested in busing some of the Rockefellers' money to the treasury as they are busing school children in Florida. So that's another issue that ought to be made to the American people. You have made it. We're going to make it stronger. I think there'll almost be tax revolt in the air if the average citizen finds out and studies it, as most of you have, that those with their multi-billions and multi-millions get by scot-free, while the average citizen and the middle-class citizen is almost squeezed to death. And of course we know that national defense is going to be an issue in 1972, because there's not any way that we can talk or compete with anyone in the Soviet, Chinese parts of the world unless we are superior, not parity, superior and superiority. And in 1968, the news media misrepresented the attitude of some of us. They thought we were warlike. But we were the less warlike group, because if there's anything that will bring about World War III, it's this nation slipping to the amount of parity and offensive and defensive capabilities instead of being superior. And that's exactly what we advocated, superiority. And hoping that we would have multilateral disarmament in the days to come in good faith, with adequate inspection programs. But until that day came, this country, with its military and its industrial technology, should always see that we were not only on a parity with the Soviets, but that we were superior. And so that, too, is going to be an issue, because the liberals in this country, and especially those in the ranks of the Democrats, want our country to unilaterally disarm. And if there's anything that would ensure a World War III, it's unilateral disarmament. And they say, well, if we do it, it'll show good faith, and the Soviets will then follow suit. Well, every one of us who have studied every agreement from Yalta right on down until this moment with the Soviets know that they haven't kept a single agreement. And so I hope this country stays strong, and that we never elect anybody president in the McGovern, Muskie, Kennedy ilk, because if we do, we will come a second. I like to comment on Mr. Kennedy is always talking about poverty, and I told Senator Humphrey before the committee in Montgomery that I used to wake up and get up on a Congolian floor in winter time and put my feet on it, and used to have water that we got out of a well, and we had lamp light when I was a child. We folks in the Deep South knew what poverty was, all the people, fine people but proud people, and that they're always trying to solve poverty by taxing the average man who used to be poverty-stricken, but by his own efforts has now become middle class. They want to take his money away and give it to those who don't want to work. So I just suggested that if the Kennedys are so interested in the solution to poverty, why don't they give 3/4 of their wealth that's in foundations to the poor, and then we'll see if they are conscientious about it, and if they want to give it all and put themselves in sackcloth and ashes, it might show they really mean business about it. Well, I talked too long in the beginning, and I had a number of things I want to talk about, so I'll hurry on. Of course, Mr. Nixon has taken action. Wage prices, 10% surcharge, which something similar to that should have come a long time ago as far as our textile and steel and shoe industry was concerned. But you had been saying a long time, you folks that are called conservative, that we were going to reach this day of reckoning, because we've always said you cannot continue to give billions of dollars away, billions and billions and billions poured down most every rat hole on the face of the earth, and the day of reckoning would come. And so it's here, just like you conservatives and just like some of you ultra-right-wingers, as they call you and I, it's here. And we found we're just about broke. And we found, as Mendel River said, we're just on the brink of becoming second-rate power, and we find some other leading members of the Congress say that we face a possible greater depression than we've ever faced. And surely the President had to take some action. And I hope his action is successful, but his party and the Democratic Party are responsible for it because they have given our money away to the point that it's no longer here. We don't have the gold to redeem the dollars that are outstanding. And the Democrats, as I said on Meet the Press, want to blame labor. And the Republicans, that is, the Democrats want to blame business. And the Republicans sometimes want to blame labor, but actually for inflation. But the government causes inflation, not labor and not management. And all these multi-billions they've spent, deficit spending in the last number of years, artificial money placed in the marketplace, that devalues every dollar in your bank account and your wallet, they brought it about. And they are responsible for it, the government of our country, and the two parties who have done so much of this giveaway of our system to every foreign nation that you can think of. All foreign aid wasn't wasted, but a great majority of it was. And so I hope that they'll start cutting spending. And as I like to say, not facetiously, but honestly, one place they could cut some off is cut HEW. They have thousands of bureaucrats. And the President, that must happen. As I hurry along, because I really went too long in the beginning about our travels, but now a President who fought in the sense the Red Chinese about going into and of course he said that I'll never carry us down the road to wage price controls. I'll never get into that thicket, and far be it from me. And of course, the President done exactly the opposite of what he said he was going to do. And he also said that he'd always be against giving until the Red Chinese change their attitude, any recognition, vote them a seat in the United Nations. But now he's going to make this trip, and even in the day's paper, the Red Chinese are saying they want us to get out of Asia. They want all their concessions. They have not changed their attitude one bit about their common goal, and that's to destroy our society. And I think it's a colossal mistake for the President to go to mainland China when we find that we have... When the Chinese, by punishing the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong today, have killed 50,000 American servicemen, wounded countless thousands of others. We have hundreds of prisoners of war and missing in action in North Vietnam, and we have an estimated 1,600 who are captives of the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. And while they are the greatest exporters of subversion, while they're killing American servicemen and Allied servicemen, while they are the greatest exporters of heroin, I don't think we ought to visit them, let them visit us. And as far as the President saying that we want them in the United Nations in the place of Nationalist China, I don't think this country ought to vote for anyone to represent the Chinese but the Nationalist Chinese. But the suggestion I would like... This may be a suggestion that comes facetiously, but I mean it. If they're interested in the Chinese having a place in the United Nations, as far as I'm concerned, just give them our place and move it out of the country. I know that you folks have been reading in the paper recently, and this is going to be another issue in the country involving black and white citizens. You know, when we say that we've accepted non-discrimination, we've accepted that in the school systems of Florida, of Alabama, of the entire Southland, we are law-abiding people. We've tried to conform with every edict issued and rendered because we believe in law and order. And we know that in 1968, the President said in Charlotte, North Carolina, I am against busing school children to achieve racial balance. I am against the breakup of neighborhood schools, and I'm in substance and effect for freedom of choice. That's what he said, and you made him say it. And had he not said it, he would not have carried the states of North Carolina, Florida, South Carolina, or Tennessee. That's the reason he carried it. And had he not carried 3 of those states, even though that was not our purpose in running, the election would have been tied up. And then he could not have become the president unless he had received our electoral vote. And had he received them, he would certainly have gone on national television and reiterated at least that particular part of his statements that he made publicly. But that's what the President of the United States said. And many of you here tonight, I'm sure, took him at his word because you believed what he said. He said, I'm for no busing, and I'm for neighborhood schools, and I am in substance of freedom of choice. And I want the news media from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Detroit Free Press, and all the rest of them to know that we're not talking about racism, and it has never been that, whether you believe it or not, because we've had better relations among people here in Florida and Alabama than they've had in some of the states from whence you come. And one prospective Democratic hopeful I hear on television tonight says Wallace's populism is the kind that drives people apart of colors. Well, I want to tell him it's he and his crowd of liberal senators when he used to be a senator and he wanted to be one again, and one reason he's running for president is because he couldn't get elected senator in Oklahoma. That's one reason. I tell you. And any man that can't get elected senator in his home state, he has a brass of an army mule to want to be president of the country and come down here to Florida. And to come down to Florida and talk about George Wallace. Well, I don't know whether I'll be involved or not, but I'll guarantee you if I am, I'll get more votes than he'll ever get here in the state of Florida. Because it's his philosophies that have polarized and driven people apart, because he's for busing, and the black citizens of Florida in the majority, and Alabama. And I received hundreds of letters to that effect. The one black family writing me, I receive $104 a month. I have 3 children. 2 are in Hayes School, and now they're sending 1 to Ramsey. And since the city of Birmingham does not provide buses, you have to do your own busing, you have to ride the city buses, it costs my daughter $12 a week to go to Ramsey High, and she lives right almost next door to Hayes High. And I don't have the $12 to send my child on a bus each week to Ramsey High. Hundreds of letters like that. In our state, we are busing children 48 miles one way and 48 miles back the next way. We are busing them 33 miles one way and 33 miles back. And the 2 schools that I had ordered opened were predominantly black, and the black citizens came to me. We appealed to the courts. We appealed to the Justice Department. We appealed to HEW. Will you help us, Governor? And I said, I'll do the best I can, that I believe that the executive authority of a governor transcends that of a court order. When the court order endangers the health and life and safety of the citizens. When it transcends that of a court order when the health and safety of a child is involved, and that's exactly in these particular cases is the case. and I issued the executive orders. But as you know, the courts then told the school boards, we'll put you in jail, we'll fine you $1,000 a day. And Mr. Nixon has been telling the people I'm against busing. But then his Justice Department that he appointed Mr. Mitchell to head, who says he's against busing, he comes into Florida and asks the courts to bus your children. And HEW is headed by Mr. Elliott Richardson, appointed by President Nixon. And he comes into court and asks the court to okay a school plan given to your school boards that calls for busing. And then Mr. Nixon says, but I'm against busing. Well, if you're against busing, Mr. Nixon, you ask your Justice Department's Mr. Mitchell and your HEW, Mr. Elliott Richardson, to get out of these courts and quit asking the bus children here. So don't be fooled by the fact that he says we don't want any busing going on because they are bringing it on. And Mrs. Hicks and Senator Irvin and one of your congressmen who has introduced a constitutional amendment, I believe it's Bennett, Representative Bennett, freedom of choice constitutional amendment. And Mrs. Hicks and Senator Irvin have introduced amendments to the Constitution of the United States doing away with involuntary busing. And so if the President is against busing, he ought to go before the Congress in a special message and ask the Congress to submit to the states an amendment that would prohibit it. So there are ways that he can act. There are ways within the There are ways within the constitutional context that the President of the United States can act, and he knows it. It's difficult to stand and criticize the President, even here tonight, with all the problems he has upon his shoulders. But this is one problem he brought upon himself, because he said one thing and his departments are doing another. And in our own state, where we don't have the money to educate the mentally retarded children, that the exceptional child that can be educated, we're having to buy school buses. Some school boards, our local school boards in Mobile, Alabama, have been ordered to bus 7,000 children, going to take $600,000 to $700,000 in buses. And we don't have the money in Alabama because we're not going to ask for any more taxes in the state against the average